Welcome back. All right, welcome back to the Rhetoric Prof stream. We started this over, and we're going to continue with the new rhetoric tonight. And this is going to be a separate video, but the last video that I did was of just two sections, sections 6 and 7, and those two sections are about the idea of persuading and convincing, and about the universal audience. So if you looked at those sections, these sections of the book are going to be very helpful for continuing to think about the universal audience. Because one thing that's very weird here, as you already see, is they finally got through this whole first long overture to their big ideas that they're going to put forward in the book about argument, how it's different from logical demonstration, how we have to think about audiences, how you have to think about adherence of minds, all of these big concepts for them and what they're going to do in this book. And now they've gotten here, and they're like, time to talk about argument. Very first section, agreement. Weird, because we don't think of agreement as the beginning of argument. We tend to think of disagreement as when we start arguing. But for the understanding of argument that they have, it only makes sense to start with agreement. You have to think about argument from the premises of argument. So in classical argumentation theory, the premises were just these stated propositions. You'd just be like, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, Socrates is immortal. These are the premises. Major, minor, conclusion. The premises of the arguments are the things that you're putting forward as being the propositions that we're reasoning with, that we're making arguments about. Now they're doing something a little bit different. They're like, well, those are premises of demonstration from the first section. We're talking about premises of argumentation, which is happening in the real world. So you can't just go to some random propositions and say, these are the premises. But then where in the world, is Carmen Sandiego, are the premises? Where are we getting them from? And then it gets really kind of weird and deep very fast, because we're getting them from how people themselves think about what's true and real and valuable in the world. So it takes on this different kind of cast where it becomes more psychological, it becomes more involved in politics of a particular moment than anything that logic looks at. Nothing like that comes into logic. So this very different attitude that it's putting forward. So that's what we're going to start with. Okay, so welcome back, if you're here. So section 15, the premises of argumentation. Our analysis of argumentation will deal first with what is taken as the starting points of arguments, and afterwards with the way in which arguments are developed through a whole set of associative and dissociative processes. Notice one little thing there, plural. The starting point of arguments, right? Not the starting point of all argument, because they're not doing the kind of, even though they say in their preface, they're like, logic is the model that we're using. Very weird thing. They have all these kind of weird ironic moments in this book, which also make it hard to read. It's hard to know when some old French writers are being ironic, because it's very subtle, it's very dry, like a good white wine, very dry, that kind of sense. But I think they're being a little ironic when they say they take their model from logic. Because here they're like, every argument is going to have different arguments have different starting points. Because we're talking about real arguments, not a method or a model of how reasoning happens. We're kind of already beyond that. We're interested in how people represent what is reasonable to themselves. The division of the subject is indispensable to our examination, should not be misunderstood. The unfolding as well as I like that sentence, be like, this should not be misunderstood. It's kind of like a little exclamation point in your thinking. The unfolding as well as the starting point of the argumentation presuppose indeed the agreement of the audience. This agreement is sometimes on explicit premises, sometimes on sometimes on the particular connecting links used in the argument, or on the manner of using these links. From start to finish, analysis of argumentation is concerned with what is supposed to be accepted by the hearers. So this was published, I think, the year after, or maybe even the same year as Stephen Toulmin's The Uses of Argument. And they're kind of making a very similar movement here of what Toulmin calls the warrant, of like, well, why call it a warrant rather than just use the old logical terminology? What warrants our movement between this data and this claim, this evidence and this claim? What allows that to happen? Well, it depends on what context you're talking in. It really depends on the context. So they're saying a similar kind of thing. On the other hand, the actual choice of premises and their formulation, together with the adjustments involved, are rarely without argumentative value. It is a preparation for argument which not only establishes the elements, but constitutes the first step in the utilization of these elements for the persuasive for persuasive purposes. When a speaker selects and puts forward the premises that are to serve as foundation for his argument, he relies on his hearers' adherence to the propositions from which he will start. So here's what they're saying in a nutshell already. In order to make an appeal in an argument, well, what's the thing that I'm appealing to? Like, you have to change your mind. You have to see it this way. See it a little. Try it on in a different way, based on what? Well, you have to give some reason. The reason is the agreement. The reason that I give for a claim is something I assume that the audience, once they have the appropriate knowledge or whatever the context that I need to provide to them about it, that they would then see that as support for the claim, that they would accept that as true or valuable or reasonable in some way, that I'm asking them to do it. So all of those things that I appeal to in an argument, all of my premises in an argument, are how I imagine the audience. Where's the audience going to agree with me? His hearers may, however, refuse their adherence, either because they do not adhere to what the speaker presents to them as being accepted. Be like, you're saying those are the facts, but show me the facts. Show me the receipts. You're talking like you're a film expert. Doesn't mean you are one. Or they may see that his choice of premises is one-sided, or they may be shocked by the tendentious way in which the premises are advanced. So this might be, you might like read an opinion column where you're like, well, I agree with this position, but the way it's argued is like they don't consider any of the opposing things. So you might say it's like, on the same side, but I don't really like your position. The way that you're putting it out, you're not really bringing me into it. Things like that. Since the criticism of a single statement may bear on three different aspects, premises will be discussed in 3 chapters, devoted respectively to the agreement on the premises, the choice of premises, and the presentation of the premises. This is such a good way of distinguishing how rhetoric approaches argumentation from how, let's say, philosophy or dialectic does, or logic, especially logic, how it does. Being like, who's choosing the premises? Like, that's not the question. It's just not a question. How is that choice being made? What's involved in that choice? And then the presentation, what words do you say? How do you deliver it? All that kind of stuff. That's a very rhetorical focus on those kinds of things. Logicians are like, that's a matter for the editor, for the copy editor to deal with for the book, Just, I don't care what font it's in. Who cares? We shall begin by considering the question of what sort of agreements can serve as premises. Our treatment of this question will obviously not attempt to draw a complete list of everything capable of constituting an object of belief or adherence. Thank God, it's long enough. We shall merely inquire into the types of objects of agreement that play different roles in the arguing process. We think it convenient to divide these objects of agreement into 2 classes. The first concerning the real, comprising facts, truths, and presumptions. The other concerning preferences, comprising values, hierarchies, and lines of argument relating to the preferable. This is a very clean distinction. They're saying every time you're appealing to something, you're either appealing to something on the basis of being real or of it being preferable to something else. It's a really nice distinction. The conceptions people form of the real can vary widely depending on the philosophic views they profess. And here, philosophic doesn't mean necessarily like philosophy, just, your worldview, how you look at things, your religious background. However, everything in argumentation that is deemed to relate to the real is characterized by a claim to validity vis-a-vis the universal audience. So you can see why the universal audience is important here. They're not just interested in the moment when you're actively kind of imagining your universal audience. It's part of their way of describing all these other moves that people make. It's a kind of concept, just like Boyle's law, an ideal that helps them describe other things within their own kind of approach to argumentation. On the contrary, all that pertains to the preferable, that which determines our choices and maybe Boyle's law is not that familiar, or it might be taught under a different name. But that's the kind of the pressure law, the law about pressure and its relationship or volume and pressure and temperature. They're all their relationships to each other. Okay. Dan, you're going to watch this and you can correct me and give the appropriate definition of Boyle's law in the comments, please, because that was, I'm sure, wrong. But anyway, that which determines our choices does not conform to a pre-existent reality, will be connected with a specific viewpoint which is necessarily identified with some particular audience, though it may be a large one. It is open to anyone to question the merits of our scheme for classifying types of objects of our agreement, but we think it difficult without recourse to such a scheme to attempt a technical analysis. Okay, blah, 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 blah. Okay, let's move on. 16. Facts and truths. So the first type of claim about the real is the fact, and the second one is the truth. For them, these are going to be a little bit different. They're very closely related, but they're a little different. Objects of agreement relating to the real can be divided into two main groups. First consists of facts and truths, the second of presumptions. It is not possible, nor would it be inconsistent with our purpose, to define facts in a way that would enable us at any time or place to classify this or that concrete datum as a fact. On the contrary, we must stress that in argumentation, the notion of fact is uniquely characterized by the idea that is held of agreements of a certain type relating to certain data, those which refer to an objective reality, and in Poincaré's words, designate essentially what is common to several thinking beings and could be common to all. So Poincaré is a mathematician. It's kind of a weird moment where they go out. He's a very eloquent one maybe, but they're kind of going out to this other kind of writing of someone who's appealing, who is really thinking at that very universal general level. He's thinking about math. The way in which the universal audience is thought of and the incarnations of this audience that are recognized are thus determining factors in deciding what, in a particular case, will be considered to be a fact, characterized by adherence of the universal audience, and adherence such as to require no further strengthening. Facts are withdrawn, at least for the time being, from argumentation. That is to say, there is no need to increase the intensity of adherence or to generalize it, and it requires no justification. For the individual, adherence will simply be a subjective reaction to something that is binding on everybody. So, when I hear something that I interpret as a fact, that means I believe it. Think of it this way. Here might be a weird way of thinking about it, but imagine, you're in your apartment or your house or wherever you are, and maybe you're in an urban area like I am, and you hear a car door slam. When you hear the car door slam, you know what it is. Even though it's a sound that you're kind of interpreting in some kind of way, but you understand it. You don't experience it as a kind of guess that you're making about where that sound is coming from. You're like, no, I hear the door. That is what I am hearing. And the same thing is what we're doing when we look at something as a fact. There's all of the stuff that we're doing that's interpretation, but we don't feel of it as an interpretation. We're like, I see that as a fact. Therefore, I believe it. I believe it in my hearing of it is how the fact is. The moment that I understand it as true. It's a fact. It's established. It doesn't need any further argumentation to support it. From the standpoint of argumentation, we are confronted with a fact only if we can postulate uncontroverted, meaning things that nobody disagrees with, universal agreement with respect to it. Excuse me, I'm going to get a little more seltzer. This is pretty abstract, isn't it? Gosh. But it follows that no statement can be assured of definitively enjoying this status because the agreement can always be called in question later, and one of the parties to the debate may refuse to qualify his opponent's affirmation as a fact. Normally, there are thus two ways to which an event can lose the status of fact. Either doubts may have been raised within the audience to which it was presented, or the audience may have been expanded through addition of new members who are recognized as having the ability to judge the event, and who will not grant that a fact is involved. So audiences can be changing in time. So this video is going to be out on the internet, and people might see it. I'm sure people will be watching 30, 40 years from now. I'm sure the world will be just as it is now. People would be clearly have nothing better to do than listen to this video. So obviously the audience is going to keep growing. And in that future, those people might have very different reactions to the things I'm saying than I would imagine an audience would have. But that's still an audience, and they're bringing a new perspective to it. So the things that I would say, well, this is obvious, and they look at it, they're like, that's not only not obvious, it's not true. It's ridiculous, or whatever. Now, the status that I was using to appeal to something as fact, it's lost that status for that audience. So the audience is kind of what determines whether something is a fact or not. It's kind of this weird way that the speaker represents something as a fact, but the audience has to pick it up. So it ultimately kind of lies with them to figure out what a fact is for them. The latter process comes into play as soon as it is effectively shown that the audience admitting the fact is only a particular audience, and that its views are in opposition to those of an enlarged audience. So every time that someone's like, well, that's not a fact, then what I'm saying is people's belief in that is based on particularity, not universality. There are other perspectives that could trouble it or something. We do not hope to find a criterion that enables us, under all circumstances and independently of the hearer's attitude, to affirm that something is a fact. Nevertheless, we may recognize that there are certain conditions favoring this agreement, rendering the fact easily defensible in the face of an opponent's mistrust or ill will. This will be the case in particular when there is agreement on conditions for verification. However, by the time such an agreement has to be brought into effective operation, argumentation is in full swing. A fact serving as a premise is an uncontroverted fact. Yeah, that's the sentence to take away. Then, when I appeal to something as a fact, it's because nobody's disagreeing with it. If somebody has a way to disagree with it and they want to and they make that forward, well then the argument is going to have to change what it bases itself on. Or I have to just exclude that challenge, just be like, I'm not ignoring that. Mere questioning of a statement is thus sufficient to destroy its privileged status. However, if an interlocutor wishes to combat the prestige attaching to what has been admitted as a fact, he will not be satisfied in most cases with a simple denial that might be considered just ridiculous. He will endeavor to justify his attitude either by showing the incompatibility of the statement in question with other facts, and attacking it for its inconsistency with the coherence of reality, or by showing that the so-called fact is simply the conclusion of an argument which, by its very nature, is not compelling. So two weird ideas here is that something is no longer a fact when someone just questions whether it is. They don't have to prove anything. Because here we're describing something as a fact when it is accepted as a fact by an audience. So when an audience stops accepting it, it's not a fact, from this rhetorical point of view. But the other weird thing that they're saying is, but nobody can go without facts or truths. Because even when I'm questioning one, I have to make an appeal to another one. Even when people try to do these like weird, spooky things, and they're self-defeating arguments when you'd be like, well, there is no ultimate truth. You're stating one. You're stating the sentence, there is no ultimate truth. That's what you're stating is the ultimate truth, right? These kind of weird paradoxes you get in. So you can't ever really do without this space that we gesture to called truth or facts. It might be pretty vague, or we might think it's really, really clear. But either way, we have that idea in our arguments. It's baked in to the way that we argue with each other. Okay. Accepted facts may be either observed facts, this is perhaps the case for most premises, or supposed agreed facts, facts that are possible or probable. You would agree that it's reasonable to consider the probability that... And someone's like, sure, okay, well now it's a fact between us. We've established it through agreement. There is thus a considerable mass of elements that is compelling to the hearer, or which the speaker strives to make compelling. They may all be challenged and so lose their status as facts, but as long as they enjoy the status, they must conform to those structures of the real that are accepted by the audience, and they will have to be defended against other facts that may compete with them in the same argumentative context. Wow, my phone battery really went... Oh no, that's a different battery. It's giving me an alert about another battery. Thank God. Whew. It'd be a dire situation. Wouldn't matter. Everything just said about facts is equally applicable to what are called truths. So here's the distinction that they're now making. They're like, they make distinctions in a weird way. I'd be like, let's really emphasize the difference, but they keep emphasizing the similarity. It's like, well, it's hard to see the difference, but that's what they're about to do. But they begin by saying everything is the same that we've said so far, but here's what's different about them. The term facts is generally used to designate objects of precise, limited agreement, whereas the term truths is preferably applied to more complex systems relating to connections between facts. They may be scientific theories or philosophic or religious conceptions that transcend experience. And I think they can even be things like, education is good. You know, that's not really a very precise or limited kind of claim. It's a really general claim. It might be a kind of maxim. So you might think about truths. I was in a conversation recently that was pretty interesting about what are maxims, what constitutes a maxim. These kinds of axiomatic statements that we might put forward as the reasons for things. Those might be the way that truths appear. That's very different than saying something like, Tallahassee is the capital of Florida. Different vibe. It's much more kind of limited, precise. People might agree on it kind of in the same way, with the same adherence, but what kind of thing we're agreeing to is different. One is a more general attitude, and one is maybe a kind of result of science or an observation made by people's senses, or something more limited in some way. So that's the distinction they're making there between facts and truths. As Piaget has pointed out, now they're talking about a psychologist. They're going all over the map. Psychologists, civil scientists, everybody's mathematician, everybody's getting brought in. That's what they like to do. As Piaget has pointed out, currently known psychological data will not warrant our conceiving the possibility of arriving at isolated facts. Nonetheless, the distinction between facts and truths seem to us helpful and legitimate for our purpose, since it corresponds to the usual practice in argumentation of relying at one point on facts and another on systems of wider import. Yeah, we can talk a little bit about what they're referring to here. I'm going to try to do it very briefly. So in the syllogism, when you have this idea of the major premise and the minor premise, there's a logical tradition and a certain kind of Aristotelian logic to say that relationship between the general claim and the particular claim, it's not maybe the most precise way to say it, what the major and minor premises are, but anyway, that is kind of part of it, a more general and more precise one. That's how reasoning happens. And lots of other traditions about argumentation have taken that same maxim or axiom and refined it in different ways and different purposes. And they're saying, well, even if that's not really like any ultimate truth, it might be practically useful to keep that, and we're just going to keep it with the distinction that we already have in our language between facts and truths. That's all they're saying. Okay. We have no desire to settle once and for all the philosophic problem of the relationship between facts and truths. Yeah, who cares? I mean, I guess philosophers do. For some people, fact is opposed to a theoretical truth as the contingent is to the necessary. For others, as the real is to the schematic. It is also possible so to conceive the relationship that the statement of a fact is a truth and that any truth enunciates a fact. Why not? Yeah, some people are like, look, it's all the same. They're like, sure, we're not taking a position here on the philosophical issues. When a primacy either of facts or of truths follows from the way in which the relationship is considered, facts and truths cannot be utilized on quite the same footing as a starting point in argumentation. Only one of the two is considered to have the full agreement of the universal audience. It must be remembered, however, that the primacy of one over the other is usually invoked only when the two types of objects are confronted. So they're being really abstract here. And rather than kind of like reading through this literal algebra that they make for this, I'm just going to tell you, I'm going to go to the next section. I'm just going to give you my own kind of example of how this comes up in certain kinds of arguments. Sometimes people talk about the tender-minded, or the tender-minded and the tough-minded, some kind of distinction like that. And you could see this as styles of appealing, some people appealing to facts and some people appealing to truths. So maybe you have this experience at a family holiday where everyone kind of comes home from different ways of life, maybe different parts of the world where they live. And so you see these collisions of reasoning styles a little bit more. So maybe you have that one kind of uncle who was an engineer forever, and he's been living in Delhi, and he's just kind of like a very practical person. And you have his older sister, your aunt, who's kind of like a little bit more eccentric, and she's lived this really vibrant and interesting life, but this maybe also still has some money troubles, and maybe her life hasn't kind of fully taken a set shape in a way that's really attractive, but also maybe there's some difficulties with it. Okay, so these are two stock characters, and they're having an argument over, let's say, what someone else in the family should do. Maybe financially. And your uncle's like, look, we have to look here at the facts. What's the actual income flow? What's the budget? We need to get these kinds of precise figures, or we're not going to be able to make any determination. Just that's obviously what's relevant. Your aunt's like, you're thinking about it the wrong way. You got to think about where they are in their life. They're coming up. They're a young person. They need to be in love. They need to have that kind of safety. And he's just like, you're appealing to all of these truths, but that's not the facts of the case. Their understanding of what kind of reasoning needs to happen might be that distinction between facts and truths. That the very factual kind of, the idea of that the universal audience that's applicable in this particular case would accept only one kind of truth, which would be the factual. Or on the other hand, that the true truth is the truth of the heart, the spiritual truth, the natural truth that's kind of deep in the world, which transcends and surpasses these particular kind of bean counter concerns. That might be a kind of another version of that normative assertion of what is the universal audience. Both of these positions have their own universal audiences that they're kind of appealing to, and that becomes a style of reasoning, which is very weird. When we think about audiences, it doesn't have an obvious relationship at first to the style of the speaker. Certainly not the style of reasoning. That's even a kind of weird concept that some people don't really like that much. But you could see the style of reasoning in those kinds of confrontations when someone's like, here are the kinds of truths that we have to go by. Not just the content of them, but the style of them. Those kinds of conflicts happen a lot, and people understand their positions as being, someone's being unreasonable when they're doing something else. They're not seeing it the right way. Okay, number 17, presumptions. So we did facts and truths, now we're doing presumptions. In addition to admitting facts and truths, all audiences admit presumptions. But although presumptions also enjoy universal agreement, adherence to them falls short of being maximum, and hearers expect their adherence to be reinforced at a certain given moment by other elements. In fact, those who admit a presumption ordinarily reckon on this reinforcement. So audiences are like, sure, I'm willing to grant you a lot of things, or there are many things that I think are probably the case. But if someone keeps relying even on a presumption that I share with them, if they rely on it and they start to treat it like it's certain, then I might kind of back away, because I'm like, that's actually not the way that I believe in that. I don't believe in that thing as certain. Like, I believe in that thing as probable or reasonable, and you keep talking about it as if it's like very clear. That makes me think of you as maybe not the most reliable or trustworthy person. You don't share the same understanding of the truth as I do. Preliminary argumentation may strive to establish the existence of certain presumptions, just as it may strive to show an audience that it is faced with a fact. But as it is in the very nature of presumptions to be reinforced, an important distinction must be made. Whereas there's always a risk that justification of a fact will lessen its status, this is not true of presumptions. In order to preserve their status, there is accordingly no need to detach them from a possible preliminary argumentation. However, in most cases, presumptions are admitted straight away as a starting point for argumentation. So what would be the one where someone have to argue, like, hey, come on, everybody. You know how it is. We all grew up together. Let's not act like we're strangers. We saw what happened last year with Aunt Mamie. We all saw the same thing, right? I might be setting a kind of initial thing. In order to get to a presumption, we know that Aunt Mamie loves us all. Obviously, right? Okay. That's the presumption that I may be supporting. These are weird. I don't know why I'm going to all these like family arguments, but I think a lot of people, these are actually what we tend to think about when we think about arguments, because they're the conflicts that really kind of shape our relationships in a very clear way sometimes. Maybe that's why. I don't know. We don't really think about political argument as much. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe people do. Okay, where was I? Use of presumptions. Oh, okay, so this idea about how much adherence. So if facts are assumed to already kind of come, facts and or truths come with kind of full adherence when they're understood that way. Anything that doesn't have full adherence, we can just put it in the presumption bin in terms of classifying it. It needs a little bit of work. But I would say, I would kind of disagree with them here to say that they always need that, or like, they kind of have that in their nature. Because I think there's another way that sometimes people argue where they're like, it's in fact giving a kind of faith to a premise that shows you're in the kind of right kind of headspace, where people are like, oh, don't second guess stuff like that. Come on. Don't be like that. Don't overthink it. Maybe when people say things like that, don't overthink it. They're kind of arguing for the normative style, the value of a style that is kind of a presumptuous, that's not a good word for it, a presuming style of reasoning. Like, let's presume a little bit. Let's be a little bit more speculative here. So that, I think that can sometimes become a style that people prefer in some contexts. Anyway, use of presumptions yields statements whose likelihood is not derived from a calculation based on factual data and could not be so derived even if the calculation were perfected. It is true, of course, that the boundary between likelihood and probability that can be calculated may vary with different philosophic conceptions. But in order to reduce statements resulting from presumptions to statements with calculable probability, it would in any case be necessary to change the formulation and the scope of the argument. This seems like a really niche issue, but it's weird how powerful the thing that they're arguing against is right now. So if you go into certain kind of parts of YouTube, or in certain kind of parts of the finance world, or in certain parts of, let's say, some kind of self-help worlds that are often very interested in reason and philosophy, maybe that's giving you a vibe. You might have come across something about like Bayesian reasoning. And Bayes' theorem is an important kind of classic proof in probability theory from the 18th century, from this guy named Bayes. I think he was a clergyman of some kind. So he's interested in belief. And he was interested in the ability to calculate how much belief you should give to something. And so he creates a little equation that's a very abstract way to do that between kind of different so it kind of works universally based on anything. And some people, kind of lifestyle influencers, have been like, you need to Bayesianize your life. you should be able to calculate all of your probabilities of your beliefs and of your actions. And this is a kind of thing that you need to learn how to do. And you can come to my seminar on the weekend and pay me, $2,000, and I'll teach you how to do this for your life. But without being so cynical about it, that idea of a kind of norm of reasoning that's probabilistic, that can apply, in the same way to all things, a mathematization of probabilistic reasoning, they're here disagreeing with that. They're like, sure, it is about probabilities, but likelihood isn't always calculable. Like, you can put figures on it, but that's really kind of misrepresenting how we really feel and think about things. If anything, sometimes it's kind of more just like an inequality. We're like, I kind of believe that more than this other one, but the things that we're comparing are really vague and undefined often. So anyway, some people really want to make that really precise and try to mathematize it. You can look into the Bayesian lifestyle if that's appealing to you. It's not appealing to me at all, but if you can't tell, let us mention some common presumptions. The presumption that the quality of an act reveals the quality of the person responsible for it. It's criminals who commit crime. The presumption of natural trustfulness, by which our first reaction is to accept what someone tells us as being true, which is accepted as long and insofar as we have no cause for distrust. Innocent until proven guilty. Got to be a trusting person. We have that trust as a value. You don't begin with suspicion. Or do you say trust but verify? You could take that line too. The presumption of interest leading us to conclude that any statement brought to our knowledge is supposed to be of interest to us. The presumption concerning, so someone be like, so what? Why should I care? So it's like, well, I thought it was interesting. Like, that's great for you, but why are you telling it to me? That seems like a pretty natural presumption to make. The presumption concerning the sensible character of any human action. Be like, well, there must be some reason she did that. Aunt Mamie. Whatever she was that she did. Right? All of these things are these really kind of deep presumptions. Really deep presumptions. But can be defeated. We don't hold them as absolute truths. So in the history of rhetoric, these were sometimes confusingly called topoi, because many different things were called topoi. These ideas of these kind of deep structures of arguments about how we generally feel about the world, it's not exactly psychology, and it's not like a particular philosophy or anything. They're really basic general ideas. They got collected in rhetoric because they were used to generate arguments. I want to show that if I want to make someone plausible as being the agent for this crime, maybe what I'll actually work on is making them look like a criminal. And that can be certainly an unsavory practice, but it can be one that does lead to how people think. Like, well, that person seems like a criminal, so maybe they committed the crime. Use that kind of inference about reasoning in order to help you construct a case. This is maybe also why rhetoric has a bad name, because anybody can use it. It's not reserved for the elite and the noble. In each particular instance, presumptions are connected with what is normal and likely. A more general presumption than all those that we have mentioned is the existence, for each category of facts, and particularly for each category of behavior, of an aspect regarded as normal and capable of serving as a basis for reasoning. What's normal? Normal adult human beings we're talking about before. I want to just be normal. I just want to be a normal. I was listening to some radio show the other day where they're talking about this contest from, I really should go read about it because it was pretty interesting. I think it was more interesting than the radio show about it was or presented it as. They did a kind of, it was some part of some marketing scheme for some stupid product, and they wanted to market it and say the normal girl loves whatever the name of the product was. And so they did a contest to find the most normal girl in Ohio, or some city in Ohio, Dayton, I don't know. And this is, I think, pretty unsavory now to our attitudes, but they made it, to be in the contest, you had to submit in your measurements, for a dress. And the person that came out as the statistically normal one, I mean, obviously there wasn't one individual, so they had a group of them, and then they picked one. It was a contest. And she was like, I'm really normal. She's like, this is the most exciting thing that's ever happened to me. And she's like, and they wrote all these stories about how normal she was. So that quality of her literal kind of dimensions being the normal then became a way of understanding her life. Well, that she's normal in her behavior and she's normal in her things. And that normal would also be of value. That was the part of the marketing thing. You want to be normal. Don't you want to be normal? That kind of a thing. So presumptions are claims about what is normal. Is this a thing? Am I the asshole? Is it normal to drink your grandson's urine? This is a reference to one of my favorite television shows, Nathan For You, where at one point Nathan's talking to there's this very insane thing. He tries to get a tax rebate at this gas station for this guy. And in order to make the tax rebate scheme work, he has to make a box on the top of the mountain so people can't really do the rebate, but some people do. And, this crazy adventure ensues. And at one point he comes back and he's telling the guy about at the gas station how it went. And he's like, these people are so crazy. They were like willing to drink their pee. And he's like, yeah. He's like, I drink my grandson's pee. For him, it's super normal. And you can see this moment where they don't have the same idea about what's normal. Nathan Fielder is very shocked. He's like, what? What did you say? That's so weird and surprising. But the guy himself, he's like, this is very normal. So again, a source of a lot of comedy comes from these different senses of what's normal. Someone's kind of like way out of what we understand to be normal. And the joke is always that we get to experience ourselves as an audience. Oh, get it? Are you in on the joke? That means you associate with our values or our understanding or our interpretation. Okay, that was a pretty weird example, but I'm looking forward to the next season of his other great show, The Rehearsal, which I think is one of the best shows ever. It's really great. Doubtless it cannot, and that is one reason why we are compelled to talk about presumptions and not about calculated probability. The most that can be said is that, broadly speaking, the idea we fear of the normal in our reasonings oscillates between certain different aspects. Using statistical language to describe these different aspects, we may say that the concept of normal usually covers simultaneously and with a different emphasis in each particular case the ideas of mean, that's the average, of mode, and of more or less extensive proportion of a distribution. So how many kinds of standard deviations is it away, metaphorically? I think mode is which one appears the most often in a set of data. So what's the normal, the average height might be 5'9", but there might be more actual 5'10" people than there is 5'9" or whatever. The normal, where the capacity required of a driver is concerned, is everything exceeding a minimum. All right. I wonder whether it's actually useful to go into this really technical thing about the normality. But here they're kind of talking about how these statistical assumptions about probability, normality, things are embedded in our language. So you don't need to kind of have a full mathematization of it in order to make these same kind of inferences. There's a relationship between how we make these inferences more or less casually. They can all be understood as being part of this kind of argument. Okay, that's a really specific argument. I do think it's kind of interesting, but it's pretty arcane. So I'm going to skip ahead to values, which I think is very interesting. Besides facts, truth, and presumptions characterized by the agreement of the universal audience, our classification scheme must also find a place for objects of agreement in regard to which only the adherence of particular groups is claimed. These objects are the values, hierarchies, and loci of the preferable. So remember the first distinction they made, there's like some agreements are about the real, some agreements are about the preferable. So the last sections we did were about all the agreements about the real. The real was facts, truths, presumptions. We did them. Now we're in the values. These are agreements about what's preferable. And they're like, here's another set of three. They're going to be called hierarchy, what they call them, values themselves, hierarchies, and loci of the preferable. Why do they use these terms? These are historical. Well, the loci is a historical term. Sorry, folks. This is how they wrote it. What can I do? This is what they call it. Okay. But notice that similar kind of three-pronged distinction, different kinds of values. And you can assume, like they did before, it's going to be based on how much adherence and what kind of adherence an audience gives to it. That's going to tell us the different kinds of values, not some kind of generalized idea about it, about what values are. Honor, piety, justice. We're not doing that game. Agreement with regard to a value means an admission that an object, a being, or an ideal must have a specific influence on action and on disposition toward action, and that one can make use of this influence in an argument, although the point of view represented is not regarded as binding on everybody. The existence of values as objects of agreement that make possible a communion with regard to particular ways of acting is connected with the idea of multiplicity of groups. In antiquity, statements about what we term values, insofar as they were not treated as unquestionable truths, were included with any sort of likely statement in the undifferentiated group of opinion. So what we thought our values and our opinions were like one idea. They're there kind of pointing to a Greek word, which comes up sometimes in rhetoric, called the doxa, or the doxastic. The way that the world appears, both in terms of its preferences and its realities, kind of appears in the same space. What do you think about doxa? Anyway, we could say more about that, but let's not. They were still considered in this way by Descartes when he laid the maxims of his provisional code of morals. Back to Descartes again. And thus, since often enough in the actions of life no delay is permissible, it is very certain that when it is beyond our power to discern the opinions which carry most truth, we should follow the most probable. So there you go. When you can't really deduce the answer, guess. Go with your best guess. Even Descartes says it. And afterwards consider it no longer doubtful in its relationship to practice, but as very true and very certain, inasmuch as the reason which caused us to determine upon it is known to be so. In this maxim, Descartes shows well the precarious nature of values as well as their indispensability. He speaks of opinions that are probable, but what is really involved is a choice with reference to what we would today call values. What he calls a very true or very certain reason is indeed, until philosophic certainty is attained, the apparently unquestionable value attaching to efficacious human conduct. Values enter at some stage or another into every argument. That's a really big claim. It's bigger than they announce it for. They bury their leads a little bit. I would think this should lead the section. This should be the very first sentence under the banner values. If I had my druthers, because this is one of the big items here. Even when you say that my argument is objective, my argument is I'm cool-headed, I'm not emotional, all of that kind of stuff, and you say, I'm just giving you the facts. Your argument is based on values. You know what those values are? My argument is objective, I'm not emotional, I'm cool-headed. These are all values that you're appealing to. And even if you don't make it explicit that you're doing that, you're in some kind of institution where we can see the way that you've presented your argument as being simply the facts is a value that people have. That's all that they want. That's what they think is the best. So we can't escape values through objectivity or through science. These are not value-free zones from the point of view of rhetoric. In reasoning of a scientific nature, they are generally confined to the beginning of the formulation of the concepts and rules that constitute the system concerned, and insofar as the reasoning aims at the truth value, to the conclusion. As far as possible, the actual unfolding of the argument is free from values, and this exclusion is at a maximum in the exact sciences. But in the fields of law, politics, and philosophy, values intervene as a basis for argument at all stages of its development. One appeals to values in order to induce the hearer to make certain choices rather than others, and most of all to justify those choices so that they may be accepted and approved by others. So you're doing mathy stuff. All of the values are kind of in the background, but they're still there. You're doing social sciences, philosophy, humanities stuff. You're talking about politics. You're talking about where to eat. Values are on stage more often. In a discussion, it is not possible to escape from a value simply by denying it. The negation of a value is a value. Just as someone who contests that something is a fact must give reasons for his allegation, I don't see that, which is the same as saying, I see something else. So when a value is in question, a person may disqualify it, subordinate it to others, or interpret it, but may not reject all values as a whole. This would amount to leaving the realm of discussion to enter that of force. It's a really nice sentence. So one thing that you can say here is, remember, there were conditions to argumentation. People can step out of argumentation all sorts of ways. One of those ways is to say, no, I'm never going to defend my positions with reasons. I don't see it that way. We're like, well, what do you see? I'm not saying. Well, then we're not really doing argument. I mean, you're making claims, but you're not defending them or putting any reasoning behind them. So you're not really interested in making contact with other minds. Like, yeah, take it or leave it. Like, take it or leave it is not argumentation. At least in that way that I'm describing it. But you can also leave the realm of argumentation by using violence. Now, sometimes violence can be used strategically to precipitate discussion and argumentation. Be like, we're not able to argue right now. We have to change the situation by force in order to make the argument possible again. We want to come to a political resolution to war, usually. Not many people would argue. It's a reasonable position. I don't think, for many people to say, what we should do is total war and try to annihilate our enemy. Not many people would want to defend that position. So then what if we're not total pacifists and we're for war, what's the end of war that we want? We want some kind of agreement or political negotiation. So weirdly, the thing we want out of war is argument. We want argumentation at the end. And so one thing that has motivated this book and motivates argumentation studies in general, I think, sometimes there's a very deep background. People get lost in maybe some other concerns, but this is the stuff that really matters in argumentation. Is like in these big important moments of human life. They might be your personal life, but it might be the life of the globe. It might be a bigger scale, universal audience stuff, concerns, things that would concern anyone, right? Universal audience values. That at these big ways, well, if these really important kinds of crucial things depend on argumentation, what do we want from it? What do we want that to look like? What kind of rules should we be following when it really matters? So these are some things that we have to think about. Do we want to just say it should be logical? I don't know. That's kind of abandoning a lot of the thought and the care to a lot of faith in something called logic, which people don't really seem to agree on how to use it or what it means in lots of situations. So maybe we need another approach. The gangster who rates his personal safety above anything else can do so without any need for explanation, as long as he confines himself to the domain of action. But if he wants to justify this primacy to others or even to himself, he must acknowledge the other values marshaled against it in order to be able to fight for them. In this respect, values are comparable to facts. For when one of the interlocutors puts forward a value, one must argue to get rid of it, under pain of refusing the discussion. And in general, the argument will imply that other values are accepted. So if someone's value is like, hey, it's us or them, or hey, I gotta watch my 6, they might be kind of offering that to you as a value that you would take too. Be like, yeah, I see that. You gotta watch out for number 1. I've heard people make those kind of arguments all the time. All the time. In classes on argumentation, people make those kind of arguments all the time. So that's not leaving the realm of argumentation. But if you're kind of like, I'm not telling you, I don't need to justify my life to you. F you. We're not talking. Well, then obviously we're not in argumentation anymore. So at the point that I'm like giving you a reason, I'm looking for the thing that you'll agree with as a value in some way in your life. So I am looking for mutual values, even when sometimes it sounds kind of like I'm not that interested in you. Well, maybe that's my value. I think everyone should mind their own business. That's a value we can share. Okay, various objections are raised to our conception that values are objects of agreement which do not claim the adherence of the universal audience. So this is another weird thing. Like rather than saying facts are about knowledge, values are about emotions or something, they don't do that at all. They only make this as a distinction between these conceptions of audience. Be like how much adherence and which kind of audience. That's how you tell the difference. Values are things, and this is I think kind of a weird part. I don't agree with them here. But they would say that things that are values are things that the universal audience doesn't agree with. I think that this is a huge flaw in this book. It's a really important flaw. And I think it's underestimated even by people who really like this book, that this is a problem. Because I think universal audiences do have values. So the universal audience, again, is an imagination of the things that everyone would accept as true. But there's also the same kind of things for these claims about the preferable. People often represent to themselves that there's a certain kind of preferentiality that is universal. Well, everyone wants things that are better for them. I don't think that there is that as strong of a distinction as they claim there to be. And I think this hurts their theorizing about things later in the book. So I did want to point that out, because sometimes I assign things or I'm interested in things that I disagree with. But in order to get to that disagreement, wow, I had to read for a really freaking long time. And I had to agree with a lot of their stuff. And I really like this book. The disagreement here is actually something I value because it helps me see things more clearly. If I hadn't gone through their argument and agreed with so much of it, I couldn't have come to a different opinion. I wouldn't have had the ability to. So I actually really value this book a lot, even though I think that it has flaws in some of its conceptions. But anyway, okay. So that's how they distinguish values from facts, but I would say I don't think that's the right way. I think universal audiences have values as well, even when we are thinking about them as imaginary. Okay. Also, the status of statements evolves. When inserted into a system of beliefs for which universal validity is claimed, values may be treated as facts or truths. Sure. In the course of the argumentation, and sometimes by a rather slow process, it may perhaps come to be recognized that one is dealing with objects of agreement that cannot make a claim to the adherence of the universal audience. But if this is, as we claim, the characteristic of values, what about such things as the true, the good, the beautiful, and the absolute, which are readily considered as universal or absolute values? And it's kind of funny to me because I'm like, already, at least one of those isn't one that people would say today. If I was like, if I asked my class, what do you guys think about the absolute? Is that a universal value? They'd be like, I don't even know. That sounds terrible. The absolute doesn't sound good. That seems really weird and out of left field. Like, it's already shows itself to be a historical artifact. They're like really concerned that people will argue against them. Like, how dare you say that values are not everyone shares values, because what about things like the absolute? And you're like, what? Absolute vodka? It's okay. It's kind of like mid-shelf. The claim to universal agreement as far as they are concerned seems to us to be due solely to their generality. They can be regarded as valid for a universal audience only on condition that their content not be specified. As soon as we try to go into the details, we meet only the adherence of particular audiences. Freedom, yes, truth, honor, freedom. Here's what I mean by it. Oh, never mind. Honor, here's what I mean by it. Oh, God, never mind. Really bad. Whoops. I'll be leaving now. According to E. Duprel, universal values deserve to be called values of persuasion because they are means of persuasion, which from a sociological viewpoint are that and no more than that. They are, as it were, spiritual tools, which can be completely separated from the material they make it possible to shape, and anterior to the moment it is used, and remaining intact after use, available as before. This conception displays extremely well the role of these values in argumentation. Again, I disagree with all of this. Does that mean I should skip it? Probably not, but I'm going to. Did I assign all the way to section 20? I think I did. Okay. Abstract, concrete values. And then what's the last one? Hierarchies. I think rather than reading these sections, even though I think this stuff is really interesting, but just I just do not have the time of my life to read this whole book. I'm just going to talk kind of briefly about these two sections and what you might think about when you read them for yourselves. Because I think it is worth reading, even though tricky stuff, tricky examples that they have here. Okay, so then they go on to make a distinction between abstract values and concrete values. And if you're in my public speaking class, we'll talk about this, or we already have. And they begin with a very simple distinction, which are things like I've been saying, general names of values: honor, piety, truth, heroism, being progressive, being traditional, whatever it is, whatever the values are, these abstract names. But then there can be more concrete values like my dog, my hobbies, my friends, my family, my loved ones, my church, my religion, my team. And why do they all have my in front of them? Well, if they're not mine, then are they really my value? It's the things that I identify with. And so there might be a kind of value, be like, I respect your values, even if I don't share them. And that speaks to a value of tolerance. We're kind of back to abstract values. So they're going to talk about this distinction between abstract and concrete values in this way. They end up making a kind of interesting claim. Again, I don't think it really is right or holds up. I'm going to give you a different way of thinking about it. But, it's interesting kind of claim that people who tend to be more on what we might say the left tend to kind of be more interested in the abstract values. Freedom, liberty, justice, égalité, fraternité, etc. Peace, land, bread. Well, that seems a little concrete. Whatever it is. Whereas the concrete values be like my church, my team, my religion, my race, might be on the more kind of right-wing end of a political spectrum, where the values are kind of being motivated through what is more kind of local or precise, something like that. I don't really agree. I don't think that's I think that's kind of like bad armchair sociology. I think that's some of the stuff that rhetoricians maybe get in the habit of doing. It's very tempting to do because you see these patterns and they pretty much work, or they work in a lot of situations. And rhetoric has a very kind of pragmatic orientation. We're like, well, what works for the thing that I'm trying to figure out, I'm trying to understand? But that might not always be a good thing. And I think here, a way that I would suggest is more interesting way to consider it is to say that every value every value is both abstract and concrete. And so we activate it at different moments. One way to think about it is what's in people's minds when you say something, like when you say an abstract value, like freedom. And we might kind of free associate. In classes, when I ask people to do this weird exercise, something like this, I'll say freedom. And some people are like, Eagles. There usually be 2 or 3 people say Eagles. I'm like, okay, there's the Americans. That image of the eagle being free is like a very weird, culturally embedded image. And it has a pretty specific meaning. Like eagles, they're kind of aggressive birds. They're kind of like, birds of prey. So it suggests some things about freedom that become a little more concrete. And then some people will be like freedom. They'll say things like democracy. So maybe they'll even go to maybe another abstract value, but once it becomes the meaning of the other one, it becomes kind of concrete in that way. And so that those various distances or differences between someone's abstract version of their value or concrete value, or let's do it the other direction. Maybe you're talking about like my dog. What would be the abstract value there? For some people, it might be love. For other people, it might be loyalty. Or for some people, it might be some kind of things like duty. These might feel different. They might still be values that people have. They might kind of mean different things to them. But they're all kind of talking about their dogs at the dog club, the dog park. They're like, yeah, we love our dogs. Or whatever. But the actual attitude's a little bit different based on the abstract value they bring to it. So thinking about abstract and concrete values can be a way, when you're thinking about argumentation or you're making argumentation, to say, well, when I'm appealing to a value, if I wanted to shift a value, maybe I can open up that distance between what someone really, imagines concretely and how they understand it as abstract. I want to make that tension more because I want to change it. I want to rename it. Or I want to bring 2 things closer together. I want to make people feel that certain kind of way they feel about honor, pride, justice, these good feelings, or negative ones, it could be negative. I like to think about the positive recreation of values rather than going to hate or things like that. But we could do that too, obviously. And bringing it closer to some concrete realities that we share. So that's one way to think about abstract and concrete values, but they do make that distinction as being 2 different kinds of value in the book. Though they say, also kind of come to the conclusion that I've said at the end of being like, well, this is a possibility. Sometimes concrete values look abstract and vice versa, and they can kind of all be related to each other. Okay, and then finally, hierarchies of value. This is stuff that I think everybody recognizes. There's always a kind of some status in life between things. We're goaded by spirit of hierarchy, as Kenneth Burke said. We're all kind of goaded by this. So, teacher says, everyone did a great job. And Kathleen, gold star. It's a hierarchy. Everyone did a great job, but Kathleen got a gold star, right? And then now it's not just about what's good, it's about what's better. And so these comparisons that people make, these kinds of hierarchies, can be at the concrete level, but they can also be at the abstract level. What's more important, freedom or security? Justice or security? Justice. That's a nice thing for someone, who's walking around the safe streets to talk about. I got to be watching my back. I exist in a neighborhood of people that don't like me. Maybe those are countries. It gets represented that way, right? So we don't have time for justice. We have to think about security. Or it could go another way. You could say, like, securing what? When we have no justice, what have we secured? We've created our own prison for ourselves. We're living in this. We've become monsters. We've transformed. There's no reason. We should just surrender if we want to be like them, right? So people can reframe these things in hierarchies by saying, even when someone already has a value, how do the values stack up next to each other? Whether they're concrete or abstract or maybe a mix of both. So that's one way to think about the hierarchies bit of it. They say this. There are a couple interesting things they say about the hierarchies that are worth reading. I think the whole thing's worth reading. Value hierarchies are no doubt more important to the structure of an argument than the actual values. Most values are indeed shared by a great number of audiences, and a particular audience is characterized less by which values it accepts than by the way it grades them. So people can talk about like, oh yeah, athleticism's good. That conversation's a real stinker at the bar. But you're like, yeah, but who's the greatest of all time? And now we're into the concrete grading of athletes as a way to think about what we value about athleticism and athletic performance and sports in our lives. It's such a fun conversation. It doesn't matter. It's like, it's so tired. Everyone talks about it all the time. At least, in my life, maybe where you're from, people have a different thing that they do. People are constantly having this argument of who's the greatest athlete of all time, but it does kind of animate your value a little bit to be able to argue about it. Be like, no, what should we really think? And in some sense, bringing all that kind of concrete knowledge to the abstract value animates the abstract value as people experience it in argumentation differently. So that's one thing to think about in terms of value hierarchies. Everyone thinks peace and justice and love are very great, but when we have to choose between them, now things get spicy. Things get interesting. Values may be admitted by many different audiences, but the degree of their acceptance will vary from one audience to another. A hierarchy which should not be disregarded is established by the intensity with which one value is adhered to as compared to another. Again, some more of this bad kind of pop political psychology. I've heard this in some TED talk where they're like, well, conservatives were measured on the value scale against liberals or something like that. They're like, and one remarkable fact is that conservatives value much more strongly than liberals loyalty. So if you put a big emphasis on loyalty, the way that this kind of psychology goes, you're probably going to be more conservative. That's a more prominent value in that orientation towards politics, something like that. I don't really buy that. I don't think that's a really like well-defined study. It's kind of working off those things, but it's not because I think that conservatives aren't loyal people. I think they often are, or often have that as a value for themselves. But this situation is rather exceptional. In most cases, not only are the values adhered to with different degrees of intensity, but the audience admits principles by which the values can be graded. Right. Many of the philosophers dealing with values have failed to draw attention to this point. Studying the values in themselves, as it were, independently of their practical use in argumentation, they have rightly stressed the convergence of values, but have too often neglected the question of their hierarchy. So, if you follow, again, this Platonic line, you start talking about all the values and the virtues, and Socrates keeps being like, no, don't give me an example. Tell me what the thing is in itself. It all kind of becomes this bland mush of the same kind of value ideas. And they're like, look, we've discovered. When you put all these rules on the conversation that it can only be at the abstract level, turns out all values are abstract in the same way. And therefore, there's the truth of value. This is really like terrible parlor trick that moral philosophy has played for millennia. It's really kind of boring. Because all you have to do is being like, yeah, but in this situation, which value should we prefer? Which comes up all the time. And then all of that kind of philosophizing about values abstractly just there's no capture on the world, right? But that's sometimes what people are like. They're like, yeah, the world, I'm not interested in the world. I'm interested in the other world. Or I'm interested in the life of the mind. I'm not interested in the matters of the day or anything like that. Okay. But they can be independent. Different relationships. They want you to read some Isocrates, who was an ancient Greek rhetorician, teacher of rhetoric. I guess he wasn't really an orator himself, but whatever. We're going to skip that too. Wow. Really, these are amazing references, actually. Ravasson is like such a weird, I guess it's a French context, but really specific references here. The reason why one feels obliged to order values in a hierarchy, regardless of the result, is the simultaneous pursuit of these values leads to incompatibilities, obliges one to make choices. This is indeed one of the basic problems confronting almost all scientists. As an illustration, we might cite an observation made by researchers in the field of content analysis, which aims at an objective, systematic, and quantitative description of the actual contents of any sort of communication. Let's just take one example from contemporary scientific research, the amazing work, just actually really worthy of just thinking about with some awe, of the engineering marvel of the James Webb Telescope. Absolutely. If you look into it even a little bit, it's stunning. The level of precision necessary to create this telescope and to have it launch, to be able to do all of these things, even with the kind of popularized understandings that they've. It's absolutely astounding that they pulled this off. It really speaks to something, a profound achievement of the human scientific community. And I mean that without any irony. It's really amazing. But one of the things that went into the ability for so many different scientists and engineers and laborers and manufacturers of material and lab techs, and just a huge amount of human labor went into this, is it needed a huge amount of money. Huge amount of money, huge budget. To the point that at these astronomical conferences where this was being debated, it was recognized that this was going to require a grant that would consume basically all of the grant funding for the next decade or so of astronomical research. So pretty much the entire people that were doing this kind of, astrophysical astronomy or cosmology, who were interested in this part of stuff, you weren't going to really be able, you might be doing other work, but you were going to take a cut. You're going to have to take a sacrifice in the amount of grant funding you were likely to be eligible for. And so even though, there was some argument about it, there was an agreement. This is worth it. This is worth an investment of funds. Value comes into science in that way, that it was considered worthy of letting go other kinds of inquiries, at least for a time, to do this collectively. That's a choice that was very consciously and deliberately made by a large scientific community. So, actually across different countries. So many scientific communities, you could say, if you think of them as separate. Okay. In general, a recurring problem of content analysis is the proper balance to be struck between reliability and significance. We can be completely reliable about the frequency of occurrence of any selected word, but this may be of very trivial importance. So even in measurement, this kind of comes up a lot, where you want to get one variable really precise, the other one becomes incredibly vague. This is a frequent reality of empirical measurements. In these different examples, the problems as well as the context in which they arise are different, and the justification for hierarchic structure, if it is given, may vary. But there are striking analogies in the argumentative procedure. In all cases, it assumes the existence of values which are accepted, though incompatible in a certain situation. The hierarchic structure, whether it will be the result of an argumentation or established from the start, will indicate which value will be sacrificed. And I think it might be good to end there. I think this is the end of the section. I assigned more than this to my classes. I hope they did okay with the long weekend in managing all of this new rhetoric stuff. It is a little chewy. But maybe just kind of ending with a reflection on that sentence that I just read. We have to kind of sacrifice some of our values in order to have values. It's a weird thing to think about. I think the word values, at least to my ear, when I hear people talk about values in the abstract, I'm like, ooh, it just doesn't really touch home. Unless I know they're kind of talking in this weird theoretical way to try to point to something that's really important, but we don't have good words for it. But when people kind of use the word values to praise things, like, yes, our values, it's hard for me to hear it very seriously. I don't know how you feel about it, but I think one of the reasons why is I think that values really get expressed or animated very often in our lives at the moment where we have to sacrifice another one. And you can even think about sacrifice as a thing that creates value. So why do so many ancient cultures, possibly all in some way, ancient cultures, how universal do we want to be, had practice of sacrifice? Sometimes it was animal sacrifice. Sometimes it was human sacrifice, or both. Or sacrifices of grain, often of food items in some way. And you wanted your sacrifice to be the thing that was valuable. Well, what did you do to the valuable thing? You burnt it. You killed it. You destroyed it. Because it's valuable to another. It could be the gods or the ancestors or the spirits or sometimes just other members of the community. Let's say in like a potlatch situation. That this is more valuable than something else is the way that we really express in concrete, real, social, economic life how things become valuable. And you can see that running through, if you really wanted to see all of your interactions in a day. See, they're all just dripping with value, and they're all just dripping with little sacrifices that people may or may not communicate that they're making in order to make these values real. How much am I going to spend in this interaction? But also, how much is my time worth? Do I need to get a raise? How do I get a job? Am I not worth anything in this economy? These questions of value are really very, very real questions. And not all value can be expressed in one medium. And so there is this weird ideology that some people have that all value can be expressed in money. But it just can't. It just can't. You can think of it here in this weird paradoxical way if you think about it in terms of gifts, gift giving. Imagine if two people, how much value is communicated when we give people gifts is really important to many people, to many cultures, the value of a gift. And when we're giving a gift, it has to be a little bit different. So this is why it's really hard to give money as a gift. It can happen in some situations. Chinese New Year is a very kind of, there's a very formal, ritualized way in which money becomes gift, which is really kind of very beautiful. But if you would imagine a more abstract situation where, let's say it's an office party, and there's a $15 gift minimum or maximum, but everyone's supposed to get that, and then two people both forgot to get a gift. And they end up paired with each other. And they said, hey, listen, I'm sorry, I forgot to get a gift. And they said, me too. You say, here, just take $15. We're like, yeah, here, you take $15. Now it's a comedy. We can't exchange $15 with each other, precisely because it's the same. It's the same medium. So no real exchanges happen. I mean, the physical bills might go across, but it doesn't mean anything. It's meaningless. So when values come out of things like exchange, there needs to be this difference between how we animate the value. We don't really know, that's not quite what's in here, and in the next section about the loci. They're not quite saying that, but that might be a useful thought to put in the back of your minds to see how animating principles, in terms of our sense of them being real premises of an argument or preferable premises in an argument, might be related to stuff that's really kind of rich with life and not just super heady and abstract and intellectual. It might be about kind of gift exchange and stuff like that. That might be a better metaphor for it. The last thing I'll say is one way you might think about audiences differently after reading this book is an audience is all of the premises of an argument. The things that the argument assumes that it doesn't need to defend, or only in terms of a presumption, defend a little bit, or in terms of a value, defend in this way. That the different kinds of ways that premises get defended, more or less, shows you the image of the audience. So every argument constructs its own audience, has to. But by the same token, the audience only adheres to that argument if it can see its own ways of reasoning, its own values represented in the audience that the argument makes for it. So when a speaker says, we are all X, the audience only agrees with that if they say, yeah, we are X. And it's that contact of minds way back in the beginning of the book that they were talking about that is a beautiful, I think, beautiful in terms of the power of its conceptualization. Very different ways of thinking about persuasion. Thinking about persuasion that way allows everyone to come to the argument as a middle point. And it allows agreement to be kind of the centerpiece and the starting point of argumentation. It's a really useful concept, but it does have, I think, some suggestions about how we might relate to each other differently too. What are we really trying to do when we're arguing with someone? What's the relationship that we're making? What's the gesture that we're making? We always, people tend to focus on the power and the strength of an argument. Is it strong? Is it powerful? Is it logical? Is it reasonable? But it's really the relationship of an argument in which you understand it. What are we really asking for here? What am I asking you to believe when I say this is a reason to believe something? What assumptions does that make about you and your life and where you're coming from? So rhetoric has a really bad name, I think, in most quarters. But one reason why I identify with rhetoric as a value of my own is because it's a way for thinking about relationship across differences. And the world is just full of that. And I hope that we can find more relationships across differences. Not all relationships are good, but they can be understood that way. So there's a lot of power in this stuff, even if it's in some really dense, chewy prose, I think. Anyway, thanks for hanging out tonight. And if you're coming on this video on YouTube and you made it all the way to the end, please leave a comment so I can thank you for spending this time with me, even though I wasn't there to spend it with you in the same clock time. We've spent it together in some other way. So let me know if you finished it, and I'll be able to meet you in your time. All right. Until next time. Bye.